Hello, Midwestern Marks viewership. My name's Eddie Smith here with Carlos Garrido, and we have a very special guest on today, Dr. Asatar Bair, economist, I believe, right? And a Marxist, communist, just like us. So, Dr. Bair, you want to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your background and what you're all about?
Sure. It's Bair, by the way.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's all right. I'm a professor of economics. I teach at Riverside City College in Southern California, and I have written about prison labor in the United States, and I study capitalism, socialism, communism. Those are my research interests. But mostly what I do, I mean, as a community college teacher, mostly what I do is teach, right? I mean, that's the like basic level courses, introductory courses that's kind of my jam, like as a, as a community college teacher.
Cool.
Definitely. So one of the things I noticed you didn't mention is your work on meditation, and that's actually what our first question is related to. We in Midwestern Marx, one of the things we emphasize is Chad's conception of a new man, and this process of personal development and this process of virtue building that's almost an Aristotelian sort of goal that we have. And it's something that we see that's quite missing in the current left. But one of the things that we enjoy about you is that you sort of have that similar spirit with meditation. So the first question I wanted to ask you is, why meditation? How do you connect it to communism? And what do you see the role between the intersection of those two?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's like because I have two prominent interests, it is oftentimes kind of difficult for me to like reconcile them, and I'm like, I never know, like people who are into what I do with meditation are not necessarily into my politics, and vice versa. I mean, there's plenty of, non-spiritual or atheist, Marxists out there who are like, I get the fuck out of here with this shit, I mean, it's so, I mean, there's always like that kind of divide, and it's kind of like, I don't know, like the head and the heart or something, like a lot of us have that kind of, division within ourselves, like the things that we really want to do, or, we tell ourselves not a good idea, or, the things that we're really passionate about, we hide for a variety of reasons. And, I mean, that's a real problem. And I think we're kind of encouraged to do that, because it's like, what does our culture uplift? It's like money, fame, power, success, stuff like that, right? Like, I mean, is that really who you are? I mean, I think that's what the salience of meditation is, to learn, well, who am I and what do I really want? What's important to me in the very limited time I have here, and to go through, a conscious path of development for oneself. I mean, I think Marxism, socialism, communism spends a lot of time talking about the development of society, and a lot less time talking about the individual, which is, appropriate, right? I mean, that's the area of inquiry. It is important to develop the individual, but it's like, in what way, right? Are you developing yourself in contrast to society? I mean, against the needs of society, right? I mean, that's kind of like how we're encouraged to think about it, like get rich, fuck everyone else, right? Like, I mean, that's very problematic. I think we want something that involves more of this sense of social harmony, but how do you do that when society is so fractured between, the very few who suck up society's surplus and, use it to become fantastically wealthy, versus, the vast majority who, let's be honest, right? Most of us have to spend almost, like a good portion of our waking hours, like at work, right? And does that provide you with the self-development that we all long for, So, I mean, I think what I've just found with meditation is that meditation is a very rapid way to get, to develop oneself, and since we're all sort of pressed for time, that it's good to have those efficient means of development.
For sure. And I've really enjoyed using your meditation videos for myself, being pressed for time, but there's those times where you feel yourself getting overwhelmed, especially with trying to share an ideology like Marxism in the West, where it's been so demonized. It's easy to get overwhelmed. You got to center yourself, kind of like you said, remind yourself who you are and what you're doing this for. And there's you talked about the disconnect between the head and the heart, kind of, and I've noticed in the field of economics, at least in the West, there's definitely that, right? It's so, the argument is that socialists haven't studied economics. They just don't understand that it fails every time. When, really there's all sorts of, there's economics is just how we interact with nature and how we use human labor. So if you're not leading with your heart and wanting to make the work, the economic system one that makes life better for the masses, then I think you're missing a huge part of what the field is supposed to be about.
Yeah. I mean, it's about human well-being. I mean, I think one of the great contributions of Marx is what does capitalism do? Capitalism uplifts an object, capital, right? Like, and says, this is what's truly important, that capital has individuality that people don't, that is like a very anti-human kind of perspective, and that your humanity is tied to like what kinds of assets you own. I mean, that's an incredibly dangerous idea. I think it's kind of reminds me of how like a lot of the accusations towards socialism or communism are really self-indictments of capitalism itself, like that the idea that socialism means everyone's going to be the same and nobody's an individual, like what's really causing that, right? I mean,
I like how you put that. In my field of philosophy, Marxist philosophers have usually been within the realm of the humanist, and although I strongly disagree with their political interpretations of what you might call real existing socialism, although I think the term itself is problematic. One of the things that someone like Fromm does is position Marx in the humanist tradition all the way from like Aristotle and Buddha and from there on, Jesus even. But people don't understand that the Marxist project starts with the concern for the human individual. It's a deeply humanistic, he calls it consistent humanism early on. It's funny because, we've had in the 20th century different theorists, Jose Ortega Gasset, most famously Revolt of the Masses, who talks about the death of the individual, and now we have a mass man. And in our country, we have Charles Wright Mills, who talks about that extensively in The Power Elite. There's this sort of phenomena of the society that's built on individualism itself destroying the individual. And like you said, there's a lot of projection going on and saying that, socialism destroys individualities, but who are individuals now? What we have is really just one blob mass. But yeah.
I think people always find a way to express themselves, but it's really like a question of like, well, what are the material conditions that lead to human development, that enhance human development? I mean, like, having to hustle every waking minute. I mean, like, I'm not going to say that doesn't cause people to be, I don't know what, like, I mean, there's probably some benefit to it, right? But like, does it allow you to develop every part of yourself? Like, I mean, I don't think so, I mean, it's like you get focused on, I don't know what, goals or just even, I mean, a lot of times the hustle is just to get by, like it's not even to accomplish some great thing. It's just to sort of have the basics of a decent life. I mean, I feel this for myself quite often. I mean, I'm kind of in a privileged position personally, and especially relative to like a lot of other, like people on the left or Marxists or whatever, or, young people. I mean, the struggle to just make it, is like huge. And like, I mean, I do well. I have a, salary. I didn't lose my job in response to COVID, thank God, I mean, like, but millions of people have, I mean, tens of millions of people have, I mean, it's bad out there. And, just the insecurity of that, like, maybe you're making it, but you don't know if that'll continue. I mean, how does that, affect your anxiety level? And, I mean, I think we all have this because we all know there isn't really a net here, unless you're rich, that's the net. And I think that a lot of the desire to be rich is really just a kind of basic desire for security, to like not be constantly having to worry like, oh, is this, is my card going to get declined or, or whatever, like I'm trying to buy groceries. Um, and that's a thing I think everyone should be free of. I think it's hard, it's hard to truly develop yourself in an atmosphere of that kind of fear. And anyone who makes progress on it has my respect.
Mhm. For sure. That's a really good way of putting it. So we'll transition here to our next question. You have a lot of work on your YouTube channel, actually analyzing the Chinese economy. And there's a lot of talk about China now, and people kind of view it in this like binary. You either think China good or China bad, and people want a simplified answer. And I did a video recently responding to Professor Vijay Prashad, who was saying this is a non-Marxist question. To be a dialectical materialist, you have to look at China in its totality. And your work is, I think, really useful in doing that because you're digging into the roots of what the Chinese economy actually was after the revolution. And then, so yeah, if you just want to give your opinion on China, maybe the revolution itself, but then what it's kind of turned into under Deng Xiaoping and now Xi Jinping.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, China, I think China is just becoming more part of everybody's consciousness because of its rise to power, and it's, I mean, I started studying economics, like in college 30 years ago. So like during that whole time, I mean, 30 years ago, people were saying, hey, by 2020, China is going to, like be a world power, and, by this and this date, it'll, exceed the United States and stuff like this, right? So, but back then, it was far, far less discussed, I mean, China was like a sideline, now that's really changed, so it's like China's on everyone's kind of mind, and there are just so many opinions and views about it, I mean, left, right. I just think it's interesting because I think the general discourse is that like anything good, and there's the bourgeois discourse, right? Like the general discourse is anything good that happens economically or in terms of human rights is because of capitalism, right? And anything bad that happens is because of socialism. And it's like, that is the most idiotic kind of thinking, like that there is like, first of all, there's this problem called essentialism, right? I mean, like when you take a complex social historical formation and you say, oh, it has these pure essential qualities, that's very problematic. I mean, you're basically asking to be wrong when you do that, right? Like, show me what are the essential qualities of capitalism in its last 300 years of development. And I mean, mainstream economics does this, right? It says, well, the essence of capitalism is it continuously maximizes wealth and it produces a stable equilibrium, right? Which does this, which is optimal in the sense of efficiency and utility, human happiness. But that is like so at odds with, and anyone who's observed capitalism, you're like, really? So you're telling me it always maximizes wealth? Really? Honestly, what's it been doing? Has it been doing that in 2020? How about 2021? How about during these power outages in Texas? Is that what you'd call maximizing human welfare? I mean, it's absurd, right? Like if you take that essentialist position, you're just asking to be wrong. So like, okay, does capitalism have essential features, or does it have a whole variety of manifestations that depend on the history and development of that country, right? So I mean, I think if you pushed anybody who's serious about this stuff, then they'd have to say, yes, okay, there's many forms of capitalism. So, all right, well, are there many forms then of socialism as well, right? Or is that a pure essence, which then we can, like attribute these simplified, cause and effect relationships with? So I feel like that's a lot of where the discourse is around China. Like, is it socialist or is it capitalist? But always with this essentialism of both terms. Um, and socialism is not a very well-defined term anyway, right? I mean, like none of these terms are, like, oh, I prefer market socialism, I prefer communism, I prefer, capital, I prefer social democracy. Like, I mean, this is part of the problem with discussing this stuff, is that what people mean by those terms is just often very, very different, like um, even among people who are like proponents of it, um, I mean, if you ask somebody what is the difference between capitalism and social democracy, I mean, like that just, you don't have to scratch very deep here in order to see like there's a lot of problems. So my position on China, if I kind of sum it up, and, I do have videos on this, right? I look at like China's history prior to the revolution. I look at the Maoist period, because this is like a unique period. So, from the revolution, 1949, to Mao passing away. I go up to 1978. My Mao passed away in 1976, but I just consider that to be like one period, and then Deng and the reforms of Deng. I just, I mean, you could do each leader, but I just sort of said, all right, I'm going to just do the post 78 period. I think the Bolsheviks, when they describe what are we doing here, right? We had a revolution in a feudal country with an extremely backward capitalist core, right? The most backward in Europe, probably, right? What are we doing here? Well, we need to industrialize. We need to, we Marxists had thought that the revolution would occur in the most developed area capitalist nations, right? The places where the contradictions of capitalism had the most time to, reach a boiling point. That didn't happen. So how do we grapple with that? What do we do, right? I mean, and Lenin, the other Bolsheviks, right, to say, well, we need state capitalism. I mean, that is the term they used. I mean, it's not. I don't think they used it as a pejorative, right? These days, it's used as a pejorative, like, oh, that country is state capitalist. Boo, that's all the problems. So they didn't mean it that way, right? They're like, it will avoid the big problem of capitalism, which is that you have a small class that gets rich off of the labor of others, right? We won't do that. We'll have the state, take the surplus. But you still have a problem, right? Which is that someone else is taking the surplus, not the workers, right? And they acknowledge that. They're like, look, we cannot advance into the higher stage of communism yet. I mean, we need to develop the country and we need to defend ourselves. We need to, like, what's the first thing that happened? We had this awful, bloody civil war. I mean, millions of people died. This is the third worst conflict of the 20th century, a very bloody century. That's how do we just keep power? How do we stay in existence, right? And China has all of those contradictions as well, right? I mean, they're like any modern nation has the problem. How do we defend our interests, right? How do we, especially when there's all of these imperialist powers about, who would love nothing more than to, take away our sovereignty, either through debt or through direct conquest, right? I mean, like, how often has that been demonstrated, right? So China starts off in a similar kind of way, right? They do pretty much the exact pattern of development as the Soviets. And because they say there's a lot to be learned from what the Soviets are doing, right? I mean, we are also a largely peasant society, right? Almost everybody in China is in agriculture, is in the rural countryside, right? Um, and so, they proceed with similar but a slightly different path of development. But focusing on, like, okay, the state owns all industry, right? The state develops that as rapidly as possible. So, I mean, so if you have capitalism with one employer, what is that, right? I mean, that's kind of like the big question of the 20th century, like, So we could call that socialism. And I think that's fair, right? I mean, because socialism is not a very well-defined term, like I said, right? But if we want to say that's all socialism is, I think that's very problematic, because socialism can take on many forms, right? Like we've already established, capitalism can take on many forms. The same must be true of socialism, right? So to say that it can only be this, I think that's just a huge mistake. I mean, we're still very early in terms of the grand historical sweep of development of socialism. So, the form that socialism in China is taking, is state capitalist. Yes, they have allowed private capitalists to also appropriate the products of labor, right? These things have contradictions. I mean, they have a lot of the problems of capitalism. But if you want to say that China is capitalist, I feel like you have to also acknowledge that it's different from every other form of capitalism that we've ever seen, So I don't, I'm not comfortable just being like China is X, right? Because the problem of essentialism is so big here, I'm like, I mean, look at how long I've tried to address this question already. I feel like I've been going on and on, like, because there's not a simple answer to it, like you need to kind of give a lot of background before you're even in the ballpark, because it's just so easy, like whatever I say, if I say China's socialist, there's going to be, some on the left and my fellow Marxists and whatever are going to be like, boo, lame, Dr. Bair sucks. How dare you say it's socialist? They got, they got billionaires. They've got a lot of the problems of capitalism. And I say, yeah, they do, but what are they doing with the surplus that they appropriate in the regime of exploitation that they oversee? Well, they are doing, they're consciously moving up the value chain, first of all, right? They're defending themselves from the interests of the imperialist powers. I mean, the United States has encircled the region with military bases, right? So we can't say that they're free of danger. They've also lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So I think and these are things that capitalism does not do, right? I mean, capitalism, if it does those things, it does it by accident, like socialism does these things as a matter of, direct planning. And that I think is, it's been shown, right? That leads to a more rapid increase in living standards, in human welfare, than if you just say, yes, well, okay, fuck the poor. And, if they like get jobs and survive, then that's great. And if not, well, I don't care, right? Because I'm rich. I mean, that doesn't lead to like a good outcome, especially for the most vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic answer. That's why I really like the formula that the Chinese are using. What they call their project is socialism with Chinese characteristics. So there's this sort of anti-essentialism going on, and that has a lot to tell us about as socialists in the U.S. of what our project has to look like. It has to look like socialism with American characteristics. We have to build it on our material conditions, on our history, on our culture. Now, it's not very often that I find a Marxist or socialist academic who does take what we consider to be these proper anti-imperialist positions. So I wanted to ask you, how has it been sort of traversing academia as a communist and the type of communist that actually supports socialist experiments?
I feel like a lot of times what I have done in my academic career is try to hide. I feel a little bit like a sleeper cell that's just been activated. Like because like, I mean, I've always been a Marxist, right? I mean, like that was my political awakening. I mean, since I was like a teenager, but I wasn't always like, damn it, I'm a communist. I mean, it wasn't like that, right? And a lot of times I would, leave it in the background, or I wouldn't talk to somebody about politics, or, I mean, I think it's kind of like it's fear. It's not wanting to piss people off. It's not wanting to alienate people. It's like, we're already so fucking alienated, like, but it's also like, okay, academia is part of the establishment, I mean, like, the right would like us to believe that it's a hotbed of, Marxist indoctrination. It is not that, I mean, Marxism is in an uneasy place in academia, I mean, like, and you can see this because while it's true that a lot of people have read something of Marx or whatever, or say that they're influenced by it or whatever, the fact is the only permissible Marxists to read in academia or to study in academia are those that never held political power, you know? Those are the ones that are pure. Those are the ones that are non-dangerous, like, I mean, there's a reason why like people love Gramsci, but if they don't love, articles and books and art stuff about Stalin, I mean, like, and that is not about, I mean, Stalin wrote a lot of stuff, right? I mean, like you could study that stuff, you could write about it. Some people do, but it tends to be outside of academia because academia is so focused on theory, and it doesn't get into like, when you get into politics is a mess, like you have to be weighing policies on so many different levels, right? And that is complex and contradictory, that's what politics is, and so I feel like a lot of my relationship with academia, I have a very uneasy relationship there. And I mean, by the way, I'm not like some academic superstar, like I'm not well known in my field by any means, like I haven't published a lot of peer-reviewed stuff, like I've published a book that came out of my dissertation, but I think that's kind of that's the bargain that you're put in at the community college level, right? You're teaching at an intro level, you're at the like lowest rung in the elitist system. And so, you don't get like a lot of respect or something, not that I'm in the game for that, but you know what I'm saying? Like, it's not like other economists are like, oh, what does Dr. Bair think? I need to know, right? I mean, I'm like a unknown figure, right? Unless people follow me on Twitter or something like that, I don't know. I think academia is definitely, on the hostile side, to, especially if you want to study, the Soviet Union or China. If you want to study Marxist theory abstractly, you could probably do that,
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Frankfurt School, not enough Lenin and Mao and the people that actually did something. Yeah.
That's in philosophy, but even in economics, the discipline's kind of been poisoned by like the Chicago School and by the Koch brothers just dumping money into it. We had a great politics professor who studied in China and he was a Marxist, but I had an economics professor who was the head of the local GOP, and her whole pitch on socialism, this was all she would do, would say, Venezuela was really rich when they had oil, and then they implemented socialism, and now they're poor, and that was it. And that actually, I mean, that spurred me to end up writing my undergrad thesis on Venezuela, and I was like, that should be illegal for her to teach Venezuela and socialism like that. It's so wrong and simplified.
Wow. I mean, every time somebody tells me, yeah, I have a very conflicted relationship with my field, I'll put out a tweet or something and I'll be like, look, the economics field is trash, and then people will be like, hell yes, it is. And I feel like, oh, damn it. Now I'm, oh, it kind of hurts, even though I'm the one who put this out, But like, I hear these stories and I'm like, oh, it's even worse than I know, like, because I'm not taking these intro classes. I mean, I took them back in the day, right? But I don't know what's out there now, And I'm like, as bad as I thought it was, it might be worse.
It's nice though that you're just teaching like intro to micro and macro, because that's what I appreciated from my economics education in college, as bias as it was, to kind of learn some of those basic I don't know, even vocabulary words in economics that you're kind of sharing on your channel. Like, that's cool.
Yeah, well, I mean, I started that because of the pandemic and because we were, like we had to lecture online and stuff. And I thought, well, let's do it on a YouTube channel and maybe it'll be helpful to others. But I mean, I mostly did it for my own students. And that's why I like turned off the comments on those lectures. But so like the first ones I uploaded were like the micro and macro, because those were the courses that I was teaching. That was a kind of, the pressing need of the time. But I mean, my favorite course to teach is the political economy course, which, I do assign Marx and Mao, and I assign Stalin. I mean, so these are courses which go into much more the like actual political details. I mean, I do the theory as well, and then we study the history of the Soviet Union. I have videos on that as well. So these are, I think, like much more controversial, much more like, it's much more detailed. You don't have the time in micro or macro to really get into like what is socialism, because there's such a set curriculum in those courses. Like the most you can do is be like, look, here's the history of capitalism. Here's some criticisms of capitalism. I'm going to try to teach this stuff critically, but I do want students to learn it. Like I'm not an ideologue in that sense in my normal teaching job. I try to do a good job of presenting bourgeois theory. I mean, I think you can probably do a better job, or I don't know, maybe it's just different. If you are a critic of something, you're going to see the weaknesses of it. You're going to focus on that. So, and that motivates you to really understand it. So I mean, that's my view, right? Obviously, I think that I do a good job at what I do.
One of the things you mentioned is who you assign in your course of political economy. You said Stalin, Mao, and Lenin. What has been the funniest reaction you have received from a student once they've looked at the curriculum?
I had a student. The first time I taught the course, I had a student who was like very right wing, and she was a good student, like she was talk in class. This is back in the in-person days, pre-COVID, right? She would talk in class and she had good things to say and whatever. But as the semester wound on, I started seeing like, well, this is actually somebody who's like a real like Trump reactionary, and she got mad like at the class and would leave. She'd leave like 10 minutes into the class. She'd just be like, fuck this, and like, I mean, she didn't say that, but she would just grab, and there's like 20 people in the class, right? Like, because it's a smaller class. Usually community college classes are full, they're usually like 40 or 45 or whatever. This one was smaller. And so, it's like very obvious. And she didn't even sit in the back, she'd just be like, get up and leave. And I'm like, you should probably stay, you're gonna like do better in the class, like if you actually come to class, and it was, so, but this person just did not do the reading, just did not engage with it, like I wouldn't mind having like a smart conservative who actually, wants to like read and engage in this stuff. Like, you don't need to agree with me about everything for us to have a good conversation, right? Like, I don't know. I think they were I don't think that it was about the reading list there exactly. It was more like that I was taking socialism as a concept seriously. And, yeah, it's weird. It's weird because the first half of the course, I talk a lot about capitalism. I talk a lot about feudalism. I talk a lot about slavery, because I want the students to have that sense of like, socialism doesn't arise out of nowhere, right? It arises out of a response to, thousands of years of society being based on brutal exploitation. And then we get a new form of that with capitalism, but we don't get an end to it. We don't get, we don't get like a situation where people are not exploiting you, you get to choose your exploiter. Okay, that's new. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know how students react to the reading list. It's hard to say.
For sure. So you mentioned how you talk about slavery and how that was itself a different economic system than capitalism. And then one of your books is about prison labor. And Carlos and I were lucky enough, we got to teach some classes. We call them our socialist night school events when we were still in undergrad. And during cool. Black History, thank you. And during Black History Month, we showed the documentary film 13th. and talked about how the drug war and how prison labor has essentially replaced slavery, and how as soon as the drug war was implemented, you see incarceration rates skyrocketing. You just want to talk about that a little bit, and then maybe what you want to see done as far as changing that, other than just socialism.
Sure. I started this project in the 90s, and it was like that was a period where the prison population was skyrocketing, and there was a kind of moment where people kind of noticed it, like where it came to the attention of the left, I think leftists have always been concerned with what is going on in prison, because it's like, here's a group of highly marginalized, highly oppressed people, right? And, we should be concerned with that, right? I mean, as people who want, to improve human well-being. And but there was a moment where people started going, whoa, it's crazy now, like the population's exploding. What is going on? That was the moment where I got into it. And a lot of people were looking at prison labor and saying, this is slavery, but they would not usually give a very systematic explanation of that. They would give a very surface level explanation. They'd be like, the inmates don't get paid or something, right? And so, like, I thought about this, and I'm like, it's an argument I agree with, but I don't think it's a very strong argument. Like, how do you deal with it when somebody's hostile to it? Like what if somebody says, well, they get paid, here's where they get paid over here. Does that make it not slavery? I mean, like, I think it's weird to say, okay, here's one thing. I mean, it's essentialism again, right? To say, here's one characteristic that if it either has it, then it's fine. If it doesn't have it, then it's this other thing, So I'm like, well, let's examine all of the forces that produce this situation in prisons, that surround the labor process in prisons. What is the culture that goes on there, right? What are the economic relationships that produce this kind of production? What are the political conditions? We have a very different political environment in prison. You have, people are caged against their will by force. That's a very, very different than what's on the outside. So I think, what I do in my work is look at it holistically, right? And say, all of these things going on produces a unique constellation of forces. And that is a form of slavery. It's a form that is similar in some ways to antebellum slavery. That's kind of like our model in the United States, right? Because that's the form that we, to the extent that anybody studies this, we get some coverage of that, like in school, right? So we naturally think of that as being like the pure form of slavery or whatever, like if we're going to construct an essentialism. But of course, slavery has got many varied forms throughout history, and that's part of what I studied. Like the slavery of ancient Rome, for example, is very different than antebellum slavery. But I just wanted to look at, like, what are the essential qualities, if there are any, right, without making it an essentialism, but to say, okay, these are you have to focus on a few things, that's what theory is. So in doing that in prison, I do confirm that finding, right? I would say yes, is a unique form of slavery. And then what are the consequences of that? How has that changed over time? What should you do? I think you have a very problematic view of kind of labor in general that comes out of, mainstream economic view, which is basically like labor is disutility, right? Labor is toil. Labor is a negative. Marxism doesn't look at it that way, right? Marxism says, like, labor is people interacting with nature and with each other, like that's not, to say that's a negative is crazy, right? What makes it a negative? Somebody brutally exploiting you. That makes it a negative, right? That makes it into work that you don't like. So labor doesn't have to be like that, right? Labor, and I think that's the dream of Marxism, right? Is to say we could create a society where we don't view it as a negative, because the exploitation of one person by another is a memory of the past, right? So I think it's like you'd like to get to that point. It is hard to look at prison and be like, prison is, it's one of the most oppressive environments, if not the most, that we've managed to create in the modern world. Like, how do you make that right when, um, I mean, I don't know exactly, like, because the contradiction is if you say, well, prison inmates just shouldn't work, that is also problematic, because labor is a fundamental kind of activity. I mean, it is a form of self-development. So to say, well, inmates should not get that, well, then what do you do then? Solitary confinement, stare at a wall? I mean, that is also very problematic. I mean, that might be even more of a torment than having something to do to take your mind off of it. So can you have labor that is not a regime of exploitation in prison? I think you could. But it's hard because prison has a lot of history behind it. It has a lot of, like, there's a reason why it was so easy to go from antebellum slavery to the convict leasing system in the South. Because those are like very similar regimes of exploitation. And there weren't slaves. Of course, were not incarcerated. I mean, that wasn't part of antebellum slavery. It's like, a slave was going to be, is going to be owned by somebody and exploited by somebody. They were not put in jail. If they were punished, it was going to be corporal punishment, right? Not being put in a cage. You were going to get whipped, or you were going to get, if you tried to escape a bunch of times, you get your foot cut off. I mean, they had pretty brutal punishments, but they did not incarcerate slaves. So that, I think it's correct to say that happened afterwards. That happened as a response to the abolition of slavery. And I think, in the grand scheme of things, if I could connect this, I'd say we did not abolish slavery fully, but we did marginalize it. Like the number of inmates that are incarcerated and are enslaved is smaller than under the period, right? Like, and if we look at it as a relative importance to the economy, any dimension, we'd have to say, look, slavery was pushed into a corner. It wasn't fully abolished, but it's still good that we abolished. Like, I mean, it's good that it's made illegal outside prisons. I mean, it's not great that there's a loophole, but it's incomplete progress, I guess I would call it.
Yeah, that's funny that we touch on that point. What I teach is ethics, and I have my sections today, and what I had to teach was a defense of punishment. So the deontological and utilitarian defense of punishment. But yeah, that's very interesting. Eddie, do you have anything else to ask before perhaps wrap it up?
Not really. Is there anything you want to shout out or promote here?
Oh, we'll link the China videos down below so that everyone can see it as well. So.
Yeah. I mean, right now, what I'm working on, I just started my semester again, so I'll have more videos coming out. Right now, I'm just working on a reading of the Communist Manifesto. I started reading theory. I started with Mao's On Contradiction, because that was the text that I assigned for my class, and I thought, well, maybe I'll help people out by doing a reading of it. And then, if you have that option, and instead of reading, you could listen. And then it turned out it was like, oh, that was a relatively popular like video and stuff. And so I think it's, with theory, it's kind of like, well, maybe not everybody's a reader, it's good to have different options for people. But it's funny because I get into the reading the manifesto. Whenever you read something out loud, you really, you see it in a different way, and I'm like, this is actually a very deep text. There's a lot of things that I had overlooked about this because I was always like, manifesto, read capital, but it really is a very good summary of a lot of those themes that you find fully worked out later on. So that, I mean, that's probably the next thing people will see. But if people want to interact with me more, I'd love to see on Twitter and whatever. I write a lot, different threads and tweets and stuff about these two themes. What is socialism, what is communism, and also about meditation and, how does one develop oneself, in the midst of all this.
Awesome. Yeah, I encourage everyone to go check out your channel. You've got good videos there on the prison labor stuff and on China and on meditation. So thank you so much for sitting down and talking with us, Dr. Bair. We really appreciate it. We'd love to have you on again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Appreciate having you, Dr. Bair. Thank you, and we hope to have you again.